Robert, it's great to be back with you. And today we're talking about a subject that is very difficult to talk about, but it's something that's been happening all over X, all over the news. And well, I say all over the news, but a lot of media outlets are not covering this. Okay. And it's the Christian persecution that is currently happening all over Africa. So tell us, what is really going on over there?
Well, there's the efforts on the part of the Islamic State, ISIS, primarily, but also Al-Qaeda, to establish Islamic governments wherever they can. There are several hotspots that we'll discuss as time goes by, but the idea is ultimately to establish a caliphate, an Islamic entity ruled by Islamic law in Africa, or actually several of them, and ultimately to unite them as they grow and take over the whole continent. This is something that's been going on for many years. Very few people are paying attention to it. I've been tracking it at jihadwatch.org daily for 22 years now. And so Jihad Watch remains in its archives and daily coverage pretty much one of the only places in the Western world where you can get news about this on a regular basis. But it's actually a very serious thing that people in the West should pay more attention to, because if massive Islamic states emerge in Africa, then that is going to have consequences for Europe, for Asia, and ultimately for the United States as well.
Now, how do we know that this is actually some sort of centralized ISIS type institution that is trying to commit these, atrocities, basically? What are sort of the primary sources that we know we can identify this as the group that's responsible for all of this? Because I've seen reports from some government officials saying, no, this is just a sort of widespread thing that's happening to Christians as well, or to Muslims as well, to all sorts of different groups. So it's not like this specific group like ISIS is coming in and committing all this stuff. It's just a byproduct of the area.
Well, this is something that if you're talking about government officials from Nigeria in particular, they have a vested interest in covering it up and in confusing people about what's really going on, because they are actually in support of it. And what we actually have in Nigeria, for example, is, in the first place, the Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP, which is obviously an ISIS group. It calls itself the Islamic State for West Africa. And that is an offshoot of Boko Haram, or Books Are Bad, which is an earlier jihad group that still exists and is also waging jihad against the Christians in Nigeria, but is happy to, even though there's a split between the two, to cooperate with ISWAP in jihad endeavors. As well, you also have the Fulani, and that's where it becomes difficult in regard to the Nigerian government. The Fulani herdsmen. And the Fulani herdsmen are also Islamic jihadis who want to establish a caliphate and sometimes operate in tandem with the other two. But they are also very highly represented in the Nigerian government. And so when you're talking about government officials saying, oh, no, it's no big deal, and we're getting killed too, these are likely Fulani spokesmen who are not going to want to draw attention to a Fulani jihad, which is what's happening.
So tell me, what is actually going on over there right now? What is the latest report? Yeah,
actually, let me give you kind of a second answer also to your previous question, because you were asking about centralized groups and so on. And so just in broad outline, you have, as I noted, you have ISIS in Nigeria and its environs, in the Islamic State West Africa province. You also have ISIS as well as Al-Qaeda just to in the same general area farther north in Mali and in the Sahara regions. You've got Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda group in Somalia. And you've got another group called Al-Shabaab, which is actually not institutionally connected to Somali Al-Shabaab, but is another ISIS group in Mozambique in southeastern Africa. Then you have the Allied Democratic Forces, which is yet another ISIS group in northeast of the northeast of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the province of North Kivu. And so you see that you've got several separate ISIS organizations in different parts of the continent, but ISIS considers itself to be the worldwide caliphate, and all of the separate organizations that are regionally distributed ultimately hold exactly the same ideology, the same beliefs, and they are working toward being able to come together. The big problem for Africa, for Christians, as well as for the world in general, is that these ISIS groups and the other jihad groups in Africa are actually generally, for the most part, in every one of the countries I named and in countries surrounding them, more powerful, better equipped, and better funded than the national armies of those various countries. France, therefore, had a significant military presence in North Africa and West Africa, but they found themselves overwhelmed as well and just recently pulled out. And the United States, under Biden, pledged troops to Somalia, but this was also something that I don't think has done anything to blunt the force of the jihad there. And so you've got the fact that you've got these high-powered groups that are extremely well-funded by rich Muslims worldwide, and nothing seems to be standing in the way of their attaining their goals. That is, capturing territory, holding territory, expanding those territories until ultimately they can join forces with the other regional groups.
The other regional groups being, so the groups all over Africa, you're saying that they want to join together, or maybe in the Middle East, they want to join?
Oh, yeah. Ultimately, they want to join the whole world together,
right,
under one single caliph. But first, they are hoping that the forces in East Africa will be able to unite with the forces in Central and West Africa, as well as the forces in Southern Africa. And now we're talking about a very vast territory here, and they're not close to this. But like I say, right now, there doesn't seem to be really anything standing in their way.
And so the goal is basically like almost Pinky in the Brain style world domination.
Yeah, it's absolutely world domination. There's no doubt about that. I mean, remember that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, said, according to a famous hadith, I have been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah and I am his messenger. And until they do, when they do, their lives and property will be safe from me. In other words, their lives and property will not be safe from the Muslims until they become Muslims themselves or submit to the hegemony of the Muslims. And that's an open-ended declaration of war against the whole world. It's not, I've been commanded to fight against African people or Asian people or Europeans or Americans. It's, I've been commanded to fight against people. That fight never ends. And the ultimate goal of it, however unattainable it may be, is to unite the entire world under Islamic rule. Now, that's not going to happen. It will never happen. But many, many people will be killed as Muslims attempt to make it happen.
This brings me back to my earlier question. What is the latest over there? What is really going on? I mean, I've seen reports of churches burning, people being killed. What's happening? Yeah,
it's increasing aggression on an ever wider scale, particularly in Nigeria. But the groups that I mentioned, the Boko Haram, the Fulanis, and ISWAP, the Islamic State West Africa province, have also expanded their operations into Cameroon, Niger, and as well as Benin and Togo to the east of Nigeria. And so the idea, of course, is to keep expanding as far as you possibly can. As they do this, they are targeting Christians in particular Christians in southern Nigeria, because, of course, there is the imperative, the specific, explicit imperative in the Quran, in chapter 9, verse 29, to wage war against the people of the book, that is primarily Jews and Christians, until they convert to Islam or submit to Islamic rule. And so, excuse me, that's one aspect of the imperative. And the other is to strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah, as the Quran also directs, so that they will see this as some kind of an unstoppable force and be afraid, which is designed to facilitate their surrender. And so we have increasing acts of terror to that end against Christians, with mass beheadings, raids on churches during worship services, abductions, particularly of young girls who were then made into sex slaves, and all of this and more, as is mandated by the Quran and Islamic tradition.
So, yeah, this is horrible stuff on multiple levels. One of my questions is, there was a post on X that was made recently by, I forget the account, but he said what we've heard over and over and over from Muslims, that Islam is a religion of peace. Isn't this like an explicit counterexample to that claim? Like, even if there are some peaceful Muslims, there are nevertheless other Muslims, like these ISIS groups, that are committing these heinous atrocities. You know, and if they had access to other parts of the world, they'd be committing those same atrocities elsewhere. And we see that sort of spill over time and time again, like with 9/11. So isn't this just a clear counterexample to that claim that Islam is just a religion of peace?
No doubt about it whatsoever, Cameron. Not the slightest doubt. The fact is that there's deliberate obfuscation on this issue, that we have heard for years that Islam is a religion of peace, and peaceful Muslims are invoked as evidence of that. Andrew Boston, the author of The Legacy of Jihad, longtime friend of mine, said that this is the my friend Ahmed syndrome. That my friend Ahmed, you'll hear people say something like this. My friend Ahmed is a gentle soul. He wouldn't hurt a fly. So how can you say Islam is not a religion of peace? And there seems to be a kind of confusion or deliberate obfuscation between the teachings of the religion and the behavior of the individual. See, I'm a Christian, but that does not mean that everything I do is exemplary for Christianity, because I'm also a sinner. And Christianity understands that, but the world generally tends not to, and says that if Muslims are peaceful and sweet, then therefore Islam must be. Well, that's not necessarily so, any more than if a Christian is a murderer or a thief, then therefore Christianity approves of murder and theft. That doesn't follow. And it doesn't follow in the same way if you have a Muslim who's a nice guy, that Islam doesn't teach warfare against unbelievers. What Islam teaches is determined by the Quran and Sunnah, the foundational sources of Islam, as interpreted by the schools of Islamic jurisprudence and the primary authorities in the Islamic world, the various ulama, the scholars and clerics of the various countries. And so you've got to look at all that, as I have in many books and articles, to see what Islam teaches. Then if you have a Muslim who is not waging war, this is just the same situation in kind of paradoxical way as a Christian who is committing adultery or committing murder or whatever. This is not a reflection upon the Christian faith itself. And likewise, a Muslim might be better than his religion, because his religion does teach warfare, conquest, subjugation, and the enslavement and rape of the captive women. These things are readily demonstrable, and that doesn't change if an individual Muslim doesn't behave that way.
And these ISIS groups, I mean, it's not like they're taking these verses out of context, or these are actually reasonable interpretations of the primary sources of the Quran and the Hadith.
They're not just reasonable, they're mainstream. This is a widespread misapprehension in the West that's deliberately sown by deceptive Islamic apologists, that they say, well, they're okay, they may grant, there may be a tiny minority of extremists who understand the Quran and Sunnah that way, but the vast majority reject it. Actually, no. Every last school of Islamic jurisprudence and every major sect in Islam teaches violence against unbelievers. This is not the minority belief of some fringe sect. You want a fringe sect in Islam? Look at the Ahmadiyya. That is the Ahmadi Muslims. They have a big presence in the United States because they carry out these sophisticated public relations campaigns. But they are less than 2% of Muslims worldwide and are actually forbidden in Pakistan, where many of them live, to even call themselves Muslims or to attend mosques or read the Quran publicly. This is, and they can't be buried in Muslim cemeteries. And they teach peace. They actually don't teach that Islam should not rule the world. They just think that it should be done without recourse to force of arms. That's a fringe sect in Islam. The major groups all teach that violence is a perfectly acceptable and sometimes necessary tool in order to establish the required hegemony of Islam.
Here's one concern that I have, and I think this is a very legitimate concern. Suppose that the peaceful interpreters of Islam, the peaceful Muslims, were somehow able to convert most of the world to Islam. Okay, what is stopping groups like ISIS from coming in and either like overturning their, views on interpreting Islam in this sort of peaceful way? I mean, what is stopping people from just like taking over the world, it may be first in this peaceful way and then turning it into like this violent thing?
It's an interesting question. Actually, what you have, I actually wrote a book in 2008 called Stealth Jihad that deals with, in a certain way, what you're talking about. That jihad is not only by force of arms. Jihad can be by the classic distinctions are, there's the jihad of the pen, that is, you can write something that defends Islam or advances Islam or protects it from critics or something. There is the jihad of the tongue. It's the same kind of thing, not always just the jihad of the sword. And that is something that is very much going on in the United States today. So it's not really so much that so-called moderate Muslims are on the verge of taking over. These people aren't moderate at all. They are just making use of the weaknesses of American society in order to establish themselves in positions of influence and political power. And they have been very successful at this, partly because, or in large part because, this is something that is not even identified as a tactic or procedure to advance the same goals that violent jihadis advance. But it's very much part of Islam. It is people who are, well, this is why I called the book Stealth Jihad. They are working toward exactly the same thing that the violent jihadis are working toward, and that's the hegemony of Islamic law over the West and the United States in particular. But they're doing so by all manner of other means, many of which involve subterfuge, as Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, is quoted as saying, war is deceit. And they're making use of that deceit in order to put their goals further.
So what is the current view? How is the U.S. sort of responding to what's going on over there? I know that Trump just recently posted something about like sanctions against Nigeria. Is that correct? Has he enacted those yet, or is that on the horizon? Like, what is the U.S. response currently, and then maybe like what is the vision for it moving forward? What
he actually said was that he was going to go in with guns blazing, which is kind of a wild thing to say. Was he suggesting that American troops would be sent to Nigeria to protect the Christians there? That seems to be one of the obvious interpretations of what he said. It's also plausible that he meant UN forces or some African Union forces, something of that kind. In any case, nothing has happened. There have been several large-scale massacres of Christians since he said that, and nothing has been done. Now, I know that these things can't always turn on a dime. We're talking about large movements of people. And so it seems, I actually have seen reports that the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, is working with some of our allies in that area to formulate some response to the persecution of Christians in Nigeria. But meanwhile, it's still going on. The Nigerian jihadis don't seem to be concerned about any kind of action from the United States, and they are continuing their terror.
Well, what can we do about this? I mean, over here in the West, I mean, we can talk about it, we can post YouTube videos, but what can we actually do about this?
Well, the churches, of course, should be in prayer about this. They should be calling attention to it. I see this so many times, Cameron, that churches don't seem to realize the implications of this for the church in general worldwide. And they or they're hung up on denominational differences and say, well, those people, they're not really Christians because they're not in our group, and thus we don't have to have primary concern for their welfare. These are our brothers and sisters in Christ. They should not be left to suffer and die alone. What can be done on a practical level? There needs to be, I think, sanctions indeed, because I mentioned before, the jihad groups are generally better equipped, better funded, better trained than the national forces. In Nigeria, in Cameroon, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Somalia, in Mozambique, they're constantly coming up against the national militaries and beating them. And so we need to find who's funding them, punish those people, stop the sources of funding, so that these groups do not have the ability to overwhelm the national forces. And
so we need to pray.
The other thing,
I was just going to kind of summarize the points that you made.
Yeah.
We need to pray, but then on a practical level, like it also seems one thing that we could do is encourage our government leaders to take action, right? To encourage them to do something.
Yes, definitely. And another thing is Nigeria itself, where the Christian persecution, I think it's reasonable to say, has become a genocide and has been going on for so many years. And you've got this Fulani government in power. That needs to be dealt with. Now, that does not mean we have to go in with guns blazing and send American troops into Nigeria. There are plenty ways to deal with the government, but that with a government that is doing evil against its own people. But that government should not get a penny of aid from the United States. And actually, the United States should be making all manner of efforts it can make to bring about regime change. And I say that on the basis of the fact that this is a government that is waging war against its own citizens. The Christians of Nigeria, particularly in the southeastern portion of the country, are trying to revive the independence of Biafra, which was a breakaway region of Nigeria that declared its independence in 1968. And it was the same thing then. It was Christians who wanted their independence from a Muslim-dominated Nigeria, and their efforts at independence were ruthlessly and violently suppressed and crushed by 1970, 2 years after the Declaration of Independence. And there are still people trying to revive the independence of Biafra. How many people in the West even know that's happening? And we need to give support to the Biafran independence movement, call upon the president to recognize an independent Biafra, to give guarantees of the security of Biafra. Here again, doesn't need to have American troops. There are all kinds of ways to accomplish it. And protect the Christians there in that way, so that if the Christians have an independent state that's not being governed by their enemies who want them destroyed, well, that's a significant step that would help.
I think one of the problems, one of the barriers that we have as Westerners is that we're so far removed from what's going on over there that what's required is a sort of altruistic ideal of we're going to help these people regardless of where they're located. And not everyone not everyone is altruistic in that way. So it might require like something to happen over here that's going to wake us up. And I worry that's not too far away. Right. I mean, we're seeing these European countries being invaded by jihadis and Muslims. And like, is it just a matter of time before it hits us at home and then we're going to act? I mean, it'd be nice if we could get ahead of this. But to me, it just seems like as Americans, we're just so caught up in our own world that we're just going to ignore it.
Yep. I think that is a very apt summation of exactly what's happening. That people think, well, that's just how Africa is. That's how the third world is. They're just always going to be fighting and killing each other. Nothing we can do about it. And it's easy to ignore because it's not happening anywhere near us. Nobody we know. It's not happening to anybody we know, any of our loved ones. You know, most Americans do not have friends or relatives in Nigeria. And so consequently, it just doesn't exist. And yet it does. And this is really what it means to be the body of Christ, that we are all one. We are united in Christ. Well, does that have any actual reality at all? If so, it certainly includes the idea that these people do pertain to us, that they are far away and we're not related to them, but we are by our faith related to them, and that we have a responsibility to them just as they have a responsibility to us. And so we should be, as the church, cross denominations, acting to help them out in this time of their need.
Are you worried that this is going to spill over to the U.S., like maybe more so than it already has?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about it. It's just it's not worth even worrying about, because it's like worrying that the sun might come up. It's certainly going to happen. The open borders that the Biden administration had for 4 years allowed any number of terrorists to come into the country. We already know that at the southern border, there were many, many people who were on the terror watch list who were apprehended trying to come into the country between 2021 and 2025. Now, that was with the border essentially open. And somehow they still managed to get caught. But how many of them did not get caught and are here now? And they could be from Nigeria. They could be from anywhere else, because the jihad is on every continent. And the jihadis have a united perspective, a united outlook on the world, a united goal, and they all hate America and want to bring it down. And so are there going to be jihad attacks in the United States? Yes. We just had the Afghan refugee who was brought here at the fall of Kabul in September 2021, and he comes here and he shoots 2 National Guard members just the other day. There's going to be much more of that.
So in terms of what the apologetics empire, as David Wood once put it, in terms of what we're doing in our efforts to disprove Islam, provide evidence against the Quran, show that it has contradictions and stuff, like how well are we doing on like at a practical level in terms of combating Islam? What else should we be doing?
Well, I think that it's devastating what's being done, and it's unprecedented in human history. You know, in the history of Islam and the history of jihad, there's nothing like what's happening now. That a Muslim in Saudi Arabia or the Islamic Republic of Iran can go online and see people challenging Islam in a way that he would never see in his city. You know, if a Christian preacher or evangelist had gone to Riyadh, say, in 1850 and started to preach, he would immediately have been killed without a second thought, and nobody would have known he was there. Now, a Muslim can sit in Riyadh at his computer and go watch a David Wood video or something like that, and nobody knows that it's going on. And so the inroads this has made into the Islamic world are extraordinary. And there was an imam a few years ago who was saying that we're losing people by the thousands all the time because they are being exposed to this, and they've never been exposed to it before. And they do not have good answers for this. For all the bluster of the Dawa guys in the West, they really don't have good arguments, and they haven't been able to hold up to the challenges that have been presented to them. But in Africa, it's kind of a different story, because there is internet in Nigeria and some of the other places in Africa that are wealthier. But if you're talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Mozambique, particularly in the area of Cabo Delgado where the jihadis are, or North Kivu in the Congo, much of Somalia, you're not going to have that access to the internet. And so you still have, and even with access to the internet, of course, it has to be acknowledged, there are many Muslims who are still true believers and are absolutely sure that their faith is right, and they're continuing. But it is a sign of hope that we should support, that there is these massive inroads being made into the Islamic world via the internet that have never been there before. Oh,
But there's a lot of work that we still need to do.
Oh, very much so. And it's not just the internet either. I can tell you that I heard recently from a guy, it was an extraordinary thing. He said, I grew up in Iran and I was a serious Muslim. And then I got hold of, he didn't tell me how, but he said that he came upon a pirated copy of my book, The Truth About Muhammad, which is a biography of Muhammad from the Islamic sources. And I've never been happier to have had my books pirated, because he said that it got him out of Islam and set him on the path that he's on now. This is something never would have happened. Here again, something that never would have happened in earlier ages. You wouldn't have been able to get the book into Iran, but somebody got it off the internet and made a copy of it. And so via modern technology, there it is. And these things are having their effect.
So I'm going to ask a question, and we're going to start to wrap things up. I'm going to ask a question that's going to excite some of my audience, and it's also going to infuriate some of my audience. The question is, I'm Catholic, you're Orthodox. What is the Catholic Church doing wrong in its response to Islam?
Everything. Everything from A to Z. Why I'm not a Catholic today. I was one for 3 decades, and I left and returned to Orthodoxy. It wasn't actually because of Islam. It's because I started to consider aspects of the teaching authority. And I realized this is not what we're here to discuss, but you asked. So I don't mean to offend, but I was.
No. By all means, no. I really am. Like, I want to be open to criticism. I want to be open about your. I saw a post from you on X the other day that the Pope had said something that was wrong on this, and so I did like I try to be as open as possible and try to consider objections. But I do want to know, like, do you think that the Pope or that the Catholic Church more broadly is taking wrong steps? Like, in what we can do with your response is do what we can as Catholics to be like, try to get us back on track.
Well, it's going to be tough.
So
because it comes from
I understand that.
And several popes now. And see, this is what happened to me, is that I started to consider questions of the authority of the church and the nature of that authority that arose from Catholics opposing what I was doing about Islam, and saying not only that they opposed it, which, that's fine. I don't care. You do your thing and I'll do my thing. But they said that I was a heretic. They said that I was a dissenter from the magisterium for saying that Islam was not a religion of peace, because the Second Vatican Council says that the plan of salvation includes the Muslims. Well, this has caused a lot of confusion among people. And I've had people say to me in the old days when I did speak to some Catholic audiences, and people would say, we shouldn't be talking about this because the plan of salvation includes the Muslims. And I would think, so that means we can't talk about what's in their texts and what the imperative that they have toward Christians is. I don't think that's really what the Second Vatican Council meant. But a lot of people say, now I know that there are a lot of polemicists, Protestants on Twitter and so on, who say that that means that the Catholic Church says Muslims are saved. I don't think that's what they meant either. They just mean that they have elements of legitimate faith, legitimate revelation in their teachings, which is true. You know, they believe in one God. They believe in the biblical prophets. They believe in the virgin birth, various things. So, but it's caused so much confusion. And this is the problem, that I debated this guy. What was his name? Monsignor Stuart Sweatland. I always want to say Strickland, but it's not. It's Sweatland. And he was the president of a Catholic college in Kansas City or somewhere. And he and I debated about whether Islam was a religion of peace. And it was the usual kind of debate where he was talking about nice Muslims he had known, and I was talking about what the Quran teaches. And that's this ordinary thing that happens. But then at the end of the debate, he says, so you're a heretic, you're a dissenter from the Catholic faith because you, the Second Vatican Council says that if the church teaches something, if the Pope teaches something, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra, then religious assent of mind and will is owed to the teaching. If it's repeated, if it's particularly, I think if being repeated by several popes is one of the key criteria for not being able to disagree with it, and that these statements are to be accepted as if they were dogma. And this guy, Monsignor Sweatland, was saying this is clearly a case of it, that Pope Paul VI, by this declaration from the Second Vatican Council, and then John Paul II, and he said Benedict, but I think he was wrong, and Francis have all said Islam is peace, and thus it is something that is repeated by several popes, and it is presented to the faithful as if it's true. So religious assent of mind and will is owed to it by believers. And I thought, as a Catholic, I don't have a response to that. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding and a deep error. But from the standpoint of Catholic faith, that's the nature of authority in the Catholic Church. So it was time for me to leave. And I had been Orthodox as a young man, and I returned, and I'm very happy to be there. But this is, I think, a grave error on the part of the Catholic Church because, well, after all, it was the Catholic Church that stood against the Muslims in Europe for hundreds of years. You can read my book, The History of Jihad, and see it. And now there's actually, what they are in effect saying is that the saints and martyrs who stood against the spread of Islam in Europe were all dissenters from the magisterium. It's ridiculous. And it shows that something's wrong here.
Maybe to sort of round things out, I can get a sort of ecumenical answer from you. Like, how can we do better overall as a church in responding to this problem?
Recognize it's a problem. The idea that we can have dialogue and iron out all our differences is not something that's restricted to the Roman Catholic Church only. It's across the board. And you can find Orthodox, you can find Protestants, as well as Catholics who are getting their intellectual pocket picked in dialoguing with Muslims because they're being lied to and they don't realize it because they don't know anything about Islam. And they are refusing to speak about Christian persecution, the Muslim persecution of Christians, because they're afraid it will hurt their deceptive dialogue. And that was explicitly said Also, back in 2013, I think it was, I was invited to speak at a Catholic conference up in Massachusetts. And the bishop there, Bishop of Worcester, Mass, Bishop McManus, he said that the wonderful dialogue we're having with the Muslims could be harmed if Spencer comes and talks about Muslim persecution of Christians. And I thought that's exactly what the dialogue's for. McManus doesn't realize it, but it is for stymieing Christians from speaking up about the persecution of their brethren and keeping them from doing anything to save them because they're afraid to harm the dialogue.